Hello there everybody, Sam Strains here, welcome back to the Railway. Today I have a story to share with you. It is a tale of caution about certain cheap, unknown, unbranded and often dubious Chinese electronics, which you should never risk using. So, don't get me wrong, even to this day I do use quite a lot of low-risk, unbranded, unknown devices and components from China. For example, LEDs and motors, I use quite a lot of those. All sorts of low-risk devices like that. Now sure, those devices might fail after an unreasonable amount of time and you will be kicking yourself for not spending the extra money and getting better gear. Generally speaking though, LEDs and motors and things like that ain't gonna burn your damn house down if they go wrong. However, there are some devices which don't deserve that level of trust, and I found that out the hardest possible way about 2 years ago, so this is that story. So as you know, on my layout there are quite a few electrically operated features. I've got my wind turbine, I've got the crane which moves, and of course there are lights in a lot of different buildings. And one time when I was shopping on the internet, as you often do, I found a device like this, which is basically an LED controller with a remote control which allows you to control your LED on your 12-volt circuits remotely without having to actually go to the plug or whatever and flick the switch. It was very, very cheap. I thought, you know what, this is great. It's going to be low risk, it's 12 volt, right? Nothing can go wrong with 12 volts. I'm going to buy this and set it up. And so I did, and for probably 18 months actually, I used this device absolutely fine, no problem at all, and it did the job just perfectly. So one day I came up the loft, as I often do, to film a review. And when I'm filming the review, I'd actually got all the intro done and I was up against my white background at the opposite end of the room and I was filming the details, as I often do. Now, I could smell burning. But alarm bells didn't ring because in those days I used to use softboxes, which used to be, my head would be here and the two lights would be here. I don't know if they used incandescent bulbs, but they were quite hot and you often did get smells from them. So I didn't think too much about it and I carried on as usual. However, as I was filming and as perhaps half an hour went on, I noticed that the smell was getting more and more noticeable and I began to think something isn't right here. So I got up, as you often do, and I had a quick look around. And I looked over here towards my sort of soldering station and I noticed, with quite a jolt of fright, that there was smoke appearing to be rising up from my soldering iron. So I thought, drat, I've left my soldering iron on. That explains the smell. So I approached the soldering iron and noticed that in fact the column of smoke was not coming from the soldering iron and was coming from the layout. In fact, it was just behind that row of houses. As you can see, there was a column of smoke rising. Now, there's no other electronics back there at all, so at that moment I realised exactly what must have been happening. And the strange thing is, the moment I thought that, crack, there was a huge bang and I was left in complete darkness. So obviously whatever had failed must have tripped the breaker and all of the lights went off. I'm in sort of semi-darkness now, but at the time I was in complete blackness. So I fumbled around to get a torch like this. I know you know what a torch looks like. Because obviously if I just went back downstairs and switched the power on, it could still be potentially dangerous. So I had to fumble my way around in the dark, switching everything off, even though I knew what it probably was. I wasn't prepared to take any risks. So, having switched everything off, I went downstairs and reset the breaker, right? So that when I came back up the loft, I could turn the lights on and they were working. So it was time to investigate. So what I did was, it was just like this. I lifted up this piece of the model, which is designed to move because obviously we need to get into the eaves sometimes. And you can't see it right now because I've covered it all to mask the smell. But there was a massive black singe on the carpet, and it's a very, very good job that we have fire retardant carpet up here, otherwise it could have been a very serious fire. The cheap device that I had used was complete charcoal. I don't have it anymore, unfortunately, because this was quite a long while ago, but it had been completely destroyed and it had burnt part of the diorama. Look underneath there, you can see there's a big singe on there, still there for all these years later. And basically what had happened is this thing had failed spectacularly and it had probably gone more or less short circuit. Now the power supply that I was using to power this looks a bit like this. It's not this one, but it looks like this. It's one of those power supplies, one of those, you know. A good quality one, it's a 12 volt. I think it had about a 4 amp power supply on it, which was more than enough to power the devices I wanted to power, which generally draw about 1 amp. And what I eventually found was that this thing had blown up. It was the power supply that had failed, so obviously it had been shorted out or something like that, and it was this that had blown. In other words, if the power supply had have just survived and carried on pumping out that much current, goodness knows what could have happened. So it's worth saying at this point that at the time of failure, my wind turbine, my crane, my lights, none of it was turned on. I was filming the up-close detail sections, obviously, and during that section, there's no need to have any of the layout turned on. So even though this was powered up with 12 volts and the power supply was turned on, there's no question of it being overloaded or overheated in any way because it wasn't turned on at the time, which suggests a complete failure on this device. As to exactly why it failed, I have no idea. At the time, I just took safety precautions. I took the device out altogether, and even today it just runs straight off the mains and a power supply. I don't bother with the remote control anymore. And I just threw it away. There was absolutely no point in trying to do an autopsy or something because it was, as I say, complete charcoal, and I just wanted to be rid of it, frankly. So I learnt a very valuable lesson that time, and it's a lesson we all know, but for some reason it's just so easy to get persuaded by a good bargain and a device that promises so much. So yes, some of this stuff can be really, really cheap. And at the time I knew, yes, Chinese electronics can sometimes be a little bit dodgy. You have to be very careful. But I thought to myself, this promises so much, it's so cheap, why not just buy one and try it and see if it works? If it fails immediately or something goes wrong, I can just get rid of it and that's fine. But of course it didn't work that way. It worked for 18 months, as I say, without any problems. And it was very cool. You could change the brightness of it. You could, I don't know, there was loads and loads of features that this thing would do. And that all overwhelmed me, and I just didn't even consider, really, the safety aspect of it. So be very, very careful with what you use. Now, these things were so cheap, and I bought several of them. So I actually bought 2 or 3, I think. This is the only one I have one left. At the time, I obviously lost one. I took the second one and took it apart to have a look what was inside, and the third one just got chucked into my parts bin. Really, I ought to have chucked it away, but I'm glad I didn't because I've still got one today. Just a quick note here, folks, sorry for the interruption. I've just realised the date on this is 2017, which means I must have bought this after the fact, after the story I've just told you. And that's true, I actually did. So I can't guarantee this is exactly the same product that failed. However, it does look exactly the same. It's the same remote, and the device, from what I remember of it, is exactly the same. Basically, the reason I bought this, apologies for the slight tangent, is that I was going to try and make a working brake van with an electromagnet here, which was going to attract something attached to an axle of a brake van and stop the wheel going round and be a real brake. And for that, I was going to control it with this so that the brake could be operated. That's the reason I've got this one. However, it didn't come to fruition, so that's why I've still got it. There we go, that's that explained. I'm going to take this out, I'm going to open it up and we'll see exactly what it is. See if there's any obvious alarm bells that ring when we look at this thing. I'm no expert on electronics, so I'm not going to be able to diagnose what's wrong with it or anything, but at least I can give you a look at it. And for this device specifically, don't buy them, it's not worth the risk. And if you're using something like this, double check that it is a reputable one and you know it isn't going to pose some sort of safety threat. So I'm going to have a look at this just out of interest. This is a cool item and it's very cheap, don't get me wrong, but please don't be persuaded to buy one of these. This is not a review, this is a tale of caution. So let's get this out and have a quick look. So there are 1,000,001 different indicators of dubious electronics. This device here displays just a few of them, but seriously, even if you know what you're doing, I can't recommend enough using reputable sellers, checking reviews and making sure that the devices are the real deal before you get them. And even after you get them, they could still appear to be the real deal, so it's very, very tricky indeed. So let's get this out. It's in like an anti-static bag, which obviously is a good sign. And this was all that was inside. You've got the remote control and the device itself. Let's get this out, which is very, very tiny indeed. So alarm bell number 1, no instructions. Most electronic devices of any repute are going to come with instructions. So that's the slight alarm bell number 1. Here we go. As you can see, this is the remote control and you can see some of the different features on there. So we've got the brightness controls and you've even got, you know, presets, so you can have 100%, 50%, 25. There's all sorts of different modes which let the lights flash and you can change the speed and things. Yeah, it's an infrared remote basically, very cool stuff. So, no alarm bells with the remote, but this device itself had a few alarm bells ringing for me. So if I try and show you up close, there we go, you can see it says LED controller with RF remote control, which first of all I don't think is right. Doesn't RF mean radio frequency? Well, that's definitely not a radio control, look, that's got infrared, so that's an alarm bell, if I'm right, that I hadn't considered, but yeah, that's a possible one. And then the really alarming thing about this is that it says peak output current 12 amps. Now, 12 amps is quite a lot of power by any means. My setup, which controls my wind turbine, my crane, and about 20 different LEDs in the various houses, pulls less than 1 amp, right? And that's including motors as well. 12 amps is an awful lot of power. And look at the gauge of wire that is coming out of this thing. There's an awful lot of insulation on it, don't get me wrong, so the wires look like they're very, very thick. But can you imagine that really, really thin wire conducting 12 amps and not getting warm in any way? I don't think so. I don't think anyone in their right mind would put 12 amps through anything like this. However, alarm bells ring. Does this look as though it's going to be able to live up to its claim of passing 12 amps? Not on your Nelly. Well, let me open this up then. I'm going to get a knife, we'll take off some of the insulation and see what's inside. This is just for interest, by the way. Okay, so another disclaimer, don't try this at home. Obviously, you don't open up electronics with knives and things. I'm never going to use this, and I'll probably even throw it away after this, just to make sure that I never do. Not that I'm likely to forget the story, anyway. So, without much safety in mind, I've just slit across here, and we'll see what components I can recognise and probably demonstrate my ignorance. Let's see if I can't get this off a little bit better. Again, I'm not bothered about damaging it really, so just keep my fingers out the way and slice. There we are, it's coming off. Okay, so there's really not very much to see. We've got some chips on board which presumably do all of those special functions. I'm sure they control all the different lighting patterns and speeds and brightnesses and things. And we've got here, which is I think some sort of quartz pulsar, isn't it? I'm not exactly sure what the name of it is, but it's a device used for timekeeping anyway, isn't it? Nothing on the back whatsoever, and certainly the pads used for those wires do not look as though they would take very much at all. So what about this failed? I can't say for sure, I don't know. To my layman brain, there must be a lot of current passing through some of these very, very tiny looking devices on which there are no heat sinks or anything like that. So it's really no surprise that this thing did get very, very hot. Although I must say I'm very ignorant about this, I don't really know how this works, so there could be some electronics wizardry going on. But either way, the proof's in the pudding. Mine blew up, and it, well, nearly caused a very serious fire. So this thing is not worth keeping. Let me cut the damn wires off it. There we go. Just so that I know I'll never end up using this. So there we go. That's the end of that. Hopefully you enjoyed the story time. Obviously, I now know better, so you don't need to tell me not to trust any of this stuff. And hopefully, even though you will have already known better, I'm sure, it's just a reminder. If you're going to buy any electronics, check that what you're buying is genuine, check that what you're buying is safe, and make sure that you're getting it from a reputable supplier, and check the reviews. Do everything you can to make sure that everything about your setup is safe. Well folks, thank you for watching. I hope that was interesting to you. Back to trains next time, and have a good week. Alright folks, see you soon.